Hi, afternoon everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Leveling Up to the Needs of Marketing in the Boardroom. Thank you to Gokana for helping supporting this and to putting this on, and also to AMEC. This webinar is part of a much bigger conversation that's going on all this week as part of AMEC's Measurement Week initiative. I'm Brendan Craigie, I'm the CEO of Hotwire, and we chose this topic because it really ties to one of the big perennial discussions that goes on in PR and communications about how we can increase our influence at the top of business and have a sort of seat at the top table. And when we're thinking about this topic, we're sort of thinking about one of the other sort of big debates going on at the moment, which is the discussion around big data. And our sense was that these two topics were sort of intertwined. If we as communicators could make better use of the data that we have at our disposal, that we can sort of do a better job of demonstrating the value we deliver and therefore have a greater influence. So in order to address this topic, we went out there and surveyed 100 global CMOs and marketing directors to get their perspective on how their comms function was using data. So I'm going to go on in a minute and just give you a brief introduction to our panel that we've got here, and then I'm going to go through some of the key findings that we got from that research, and hopefully we're going to have an interesting and lively debate around those. So to introduce our panel, before I do, here's a quote from Bill Gates, which I think probably we would all identify with in terms of the importance of measuring what we do and learning from that experience. So yesterday I was at another MX seminar, and Barry Legater sort of asked the question of whether measurement is sexy enough. So I'm throwing down the gauntlet to our panel here today to see if we can hopefully sort of liven up that topic. And so I have with me Imogen Osborne, who has 20 years experience in the comms industry, has done lots of big jobs both on the client side and on the agency side. Is also an entrepreneur and is the co-founder of Question Retain, which is heavily involved in using data in comms. We've got Nick Landsman, who's the co-founder, the founder and the group managing director of Political Intelligence, a European-wide public affairs firm. And then we also have James Hardy, who's going to give us that C-level perspective. He currently is the CEO of TradeWise, was previously the head of Europe for Alibaba, and also knows his PR, having worked as a legal counsel for one of the large PR groups. So there's an introduction to the panel. Dropping down into the data, and I'll just say if anyone wants to follow the debate, pose questions, then you can use the hashtag HWData or hashtag AMECatWork. So the first question that we looked at was looking at how, in the opinion of marketeers, senior marketeers, was comms using data in their business. And we gave a few different options, looking at whether it was primarily in future campaign and communication strategies, whether it was to analyze past performance, whether it's in real-time planning, or whether they just weren't using it at all. The exciting thing for me here was that what we found is that the majority, 51%, were primarily using data from PR and social media in order to inform future campaigns and communication strategies. So it's almost like, although this is Measurement Week and we're talking about measurement, it feels to me from this finding that almost like planning has surpassed measurement as the primary use of data in PR and comms. So looking around to the panel here, just wondering, what people thought about this.
We need to change the name to strategic planning and measurement. I don't know, maybe some opening remarks. The fact that it's so evenly split between people who are using data forward-looking and then people who are analysing what they've done is very interesting, but it doesn't surprise me. For me, this smacks of the different needs. So if you're looking at data being used by CEOs and boards, maybe, they will have a different need from those perhaps justifying a certain type of comms spend. And equally, those boardrooms, directors and CEOs are also very different. Some will be visionary, heads of startups, entrepreneurial, who just want to use data to keep that one step ahead of the competition. And other CEOs might be more risk-averse very interested in keeping a stable ship and looking at small incremental in share price and measuring that sort of data, maybe their financial directors possibly running the company. But those, for me, are a couple of things of why you might get that forward-looking and backward-looking, I suppose, effect in the data.
Okay. Well, thanks, Nick. And Imogen?
Well, I would say, I mean, just going back to that point about data being sexy, I would say yes, absolutely, for the simple reason that it enables a better conversation. Whether you're using data to inform your planning or to help inform best practice or to get that piece of strategy right, as Nick says, the key is that the data enables you to be relevant. It enables that richer conversation, and it's just a great neutralizer. If you think of sort of having difficult conversations with people in life, whether that's your partner, your friend, your adversary, your competitor, whoever that may be, the conversation is made so much more valuable if it's driven by data, because you can't refute it. It's there. It's one piece of a very, very important part of an overall process, a planning process. And certainly one of the things that I've observed that a large telecoms company was doing recently was using data to inform best practice in terms of finding out, quite simply, are we right to invest all this money in sponsoring a major sporting event? And I think getting that data back in real time has a brilliant influence on the planning process, because you're managing everything in real time and you're not in back step, you're in front step.
James, what's your thought on this? I mean, you as a CEO, are you sort of do you think this is positive that people are using data primarily in planning, or would you be more interested would you want them to be using it more in measurement?
I think overall that data for the measurement data tells us how good the data was on the planning side. And so there's a feedback loop that's evolving here, and so I predict that that number of 51% will go up over time as the measurement data over time shows that the planning data is improving. I think my overall view in respect of data from a big picture point of view is that it's probably a necessary but not sufficient criteria in the planning involvement, because otherwise eventually planning can really be done purely by an analytic approach. And we all know from the very best people that we've all worked with who are brilliant, especially in the field of PR particularly, you get people who are brilliant at PR who get the most fantastic coverage, and sometimes they don't rely on data at all. Now they're the outliers and they're rare, but they do prove, and really the exception to some extent proves that rule that data is important, but they do prove also that data is not the only thing that matters. Yeah. It's a key piece, but not critical.
I mean, I guess one of the other points related to this, I know as an industry we've long debated the idea of whether we should have planners, in our, as in should agencies, should we be, employing dedicated specialist planners? This seems to suggest that we're all planning, and that maybe we, does this mean, what do you think about that? I mean, should we have specialists doing this?
Well, I think that clients these days, when a creative idea is suggested to them, they look to data to justify why the idea would work. They have to, if you're on the agency side and you've got a great concept, brilliant media campaign, unless you can prove that journalists have followed this particular storyline, it's going to make it a lot harder to sell to the client. So the client needs the data to reassure them. Whether it should become a major practice or a default button that has to be pressed with every campaign, I don't know. My sense is that you shouldn't overplan, because that can stifle innovation. It can stifle creativity, and creativity is such an important part of the comms process. But I do think, as I said at the beginning, data is very sexy because it tells you a story and it tells you how things are, and that is very valuable.
Yeah, I think adding to your point, I think it's you're going to, at some point, to do things differently, to make things exciting and innovative, you're going to have to rely on a gut feeling occasionally. I think that's actually what makes people's jobs quite exciting. You're not always going to have that data. Yes, you can use data sets that maybe are similar to a campaign, but actually you're going to sometimes have to rely on common sense, gut feeling, being ahead of the market and saying, we've got no data, let's do it anyway and give it a go. And that sounds quite exciting in business.
I think this sort of takes us on quite nicely to the sort of the second point, which is where we looked at how effectively does your communications department use data to inform, use data and insights to inform strategy and planning. Similarly, positive response here, with 83% saying they thought data was being used effectively. So it really does feel like, you know, the comms departments, in the eyes of senior marketeers, have done a great job of mastering using data as a planning tool. Great.
Well, yeah. Well, I mean,
Nick, so this is Nick joining the.
Sorry, yeah. Introduce me. Yeah. Just, I suppose, a couple of remarks on this. Is this confidence or delusion? 83% is actually quite ambitious, and I would say that you know, you don't know what you don't know, and if you're using a data set and thinking you're effective with it, you might not be asking the right questions. And looking at this, obviously, I run a public affairs, government relations consultancy, and looking at companies that follow public policy, regulation, what's happening in policy generally, they are going to be better informed. So if you're not, as a company, asking questions around data usage and getting insights of what's going to be happening in terms of the regulatory, political space, you might be missing a trick. And I think there are boards, certainly CEOs, are kept awake at night by these sorts of policy issues. Maybe I've mentioned just 2 or 3 of them to give some explanation of what I mean. But we know there are going to be new rules coming in around corporation tax rules. We know those are going to be very important, front of mind for all CEOs. So if you're not monitoring these sorts of regulatory change around corporation tax, equally we also know the European Union is going to be looking at passing more legislation around the greening of technology devices, technology to protect the environment. And of course, we've had a lot of coverage over the last year or 2 about privacy and data protection. Again, a couple of areas where we know there's going to be more legislation over the next 2 years coming out of Brussels. So those are just 2 or 3 of the areas where I think if we're not spotting these things and not asking the right questions, this complacency about how effective you are in analysing data may be something to consider.
I would also add to that and say that word that interests me in that question is insight, in terms of it's one thing to get the data, but then it's another thing to take insight from it, in terms of how can you look at a particular way you're doing something and improve it based on what the data is telling you and based on what the data isn't telling you. It's very easy to assume just because you're given a data point that that's the whole story. Invariably, it's not the whole story. Invariably, it means that you need to get behind what that statistic means. And actually, by getting behind that statistic will lead you to further insight, which is all part of the learning process. And I think the more open we can be to that as individuals, the better. You know, sometimes people look at feedback, look at data, and they start to clam up and they take it personally and they see it as a criticism of them. Actually, no, if we look at it in its broadest sense and depersonalise what we're seeing, see the data, see the learning curve, then that's only going to help us develop more as individuals, in whether it's a service we're providing or a product we're designing, whatever it may be.
Yeah, I think that actually to Nick's point is, do people really understand the data? And in fact, it's interesting because if you look at the first question here, where it's, you know, what best describes how you use PR and data, and 51% think that PR and social media data, 51% use it to inform future campaign strategies, but 83% are thinking that it's used effectively in strategy and planning. So there's a gap there, and the question is, why is that? Why is there a gap there? And to some extent, I think it's that they're not necessarily using it themselves, but they're thinking that some other people are using it, or maybe people in their team are using it, especially, you know, people who are answering these surveys are very often the businesses. So I think right there, it's not completely clear for a lot of people exactly who is using that data effectively. They know that somebody should be, They know that it could be being used effectively, but is it them? It looks like it's 51% of them right now who are actually using it, even though 83% think it's being used effectively.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, I guess, and I've thought about how it feels over the last sort of 5-10 years. There's been sort of a democratization of measurement, because today you have access to so many different tools. A lot of them are free, but at the same time, as we've gone on that journey, it's not necessarily the case that people have had the training that comes along with that in terms of how you methodically and thoroughly analyze different results. So, as someone, Imogen, who works in research, does it worry you that that people maybe don't have the skills to interpret data that they're working with?
Does it worry me? In part, I think I'm more interested in how people act on the data, actually, how they sort of absorb what they're being told. It comes back to that sort of psychological point about, depersonalizing it. Some people may have seen fastcompany.com did some very interesting research recently around how you take feedback into your organization. Whether you are an agency, whether you're a company like eBay, Amazon, whatever. And they talk about this concept of thick-skinned thinking, and the fact that every piece of feedback you get enables you to deliver your service in an even better way. It enables you to innovate. It enables you to make more money at the end of the day. So my worry, the thing that would keep me awake at night is, are people acting on the data? Are they actually doing something positive with it? Because you go to all the bother of getting the feedback, and it would just be such a shame to think it just goes in the pending file, and everyone just heaves a sigh of relief because they think, oh, it's all right, I've done that, so I don't need to worry about it now. But actually, as we've said, in today's world where data, news cycles, everything are moving apace so quickly, can you really afford to rest on your laurels? Is it not a good idea to look at what's being said about your service and do something really positive with it? Because that can only be a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, just moving on to the next point, which sort of builds upon this, is we're trying just to get a sense of how equipped people felt they were in order to extract insights from their PR and social data. In terms of, there's lots of discussion about different tools, such as Gorkana's, tools that are available. We actually went to the lengths of building our own software platform in order to help us get insights that we wanted. And from the audience here, 79% thought they agreed with the statement that their organization is well equipped to extract meaningful insights from PR and social data it collects. So this seems to give the impression that if you're not equipped, if you don't feel like you have those tools, that you're very much in the minority and you're sort of been left behind.
I just wanted to make one comment on data generally. That I think that, I mean, Stephen Levitt recently, who wrote all about Freakonomics and everything else, he said that really there's not going to be such a thing as big data that's going to give meaningful analyses. And when you sort of read into his comments, he was driving at the fact that really there's going to be smaller data. It's not going to be this knowing every single thing from every single, because you get too many variables. Once you have too many variables, it becomes very, very difficult to extract really meaningful data. The skill, to some extent, in data, and I think that this quote is right, the organization is well equipped. It's because we've all got the power, we've all got the software and the tools available. The skill comes in asking the right questions and, in fact, framing the right the right analytics, and that's really where the skill of people like with your even listening post, which I think was fabulous. I mean, we had a look at Hotwire's listening post, so it was great. Or what Gorkana, or the Gorkana offerings, the skill is in the people who can actually say this is what you should be looking at. And then the meaningful insights come out, because the processing power is there. It's actually not necessarily there for big data unless you're McLaren Formula One. No. There are very few people who've got that level of processing, or even Alibaba, who've got walk for over half a mile past the server room, and it's 200 meters deep and over half a mile long. Those people got the processing power for big data, but most people still have processing power to extract meaningful insights. But they have to be framing the analysis in the right way up front, which to some extent has parallels between planning and then measurement on the back end.
I think there's still the infancy of understanding sort of social media data and its importance. Whether a bunch of tweets are actually meaningful, or whether actual conversations, direct messages between people, are actually more meaningful, even though there might be a fewer. There's also that expression of empty vessels make the most noise. We just, as an example, we did an event in Parliament, and that was not meant to be just after that last quote, because I'm sure politicians are saying very sensible things. We did an event around the Twitter Awards. We did this idea of giving politicians in Parliament a certificate for the greatest increase in followers, or the greatest number of retweets, or and so forth. And we came back with some interesting, obviously we gave certificates, and lots of MPs were very happy, some were less happy. But we found some interesting stats came out of it. In 2008, there were only 7 MPs on Twitter. But by this year, nearly 500 MPs are on Twitter, which we thought was quite interesting. And between those 500 MPs, there are about just under 1,000 tweets a day, which is quite a lot. So it goes back to the point of meaningful analysis of data. Are we to look at all those tweets and try and predict, are there interesting changes in policy going to be afoot, and so forth? But we also discovered that less than 20 MPs do 30% of all those tweets. And actually, there's a small cohort of very few people who literally tweet constantly. So when you start looking at the deep, meaningful analysis of that part of social media in the political context, you have to be quite skeptical, and you have to really drill down into detail. It may be there is a very small group of very influential politicians, but are they just making a lot of noise and have no impact over the final policy, for example? And that's something that I think we were discussing earlier.
So really, I think picking some of those points together, it's really that without the experience to appreciate the context of that information, that that data is obviously a lot less valuable, and it's more about almost. I think we've written blog posts where we're talking about where it's more about small data rather than big data, as it's really about honing in on the areas that's most relevant and most important. Someone's actually asked, can we say a bit more information on who was polled? So it was a representative sample of CMOs and directors of marketing for a variety of business sizes from small to large, the majority of which had got global roles. So really predominantly looking at UK-based heads of marketing with a global or international remit. The next question, which I think those first 3 questions are all quite connected. The third question, which I think prompted quite a lot of interest and excitement when I first came across it, was a question looking at the ability of the comms teams to be able to act on data and events and insights in real time, if required, or immediately if required. And what was sort of very striking about this is that despite the fact that today we operate in very much a 24/7 media environment, I mean, if you look at any of the charts around when people interact with media, a lot of it's going on in the evening, on the sofa. Only 53% felt that they were always on in terms of their ability to act in real time. And this strikes me as being, a sort of a big wake-up call for communication, for the communication sector, that we need to be better equipped. I mean, I don't know what you guys think.
Well, do you want to go ahead?
I was going to say, I mean, it's a very interesting data point, because it's not only, you've got to think about it on 2 levels. One, what you do as a professional, and one, what you do as an individual person outside of work, as it were, outside of your agency. And I think there's a certain nimbleness that's required to allow you to achieve that sort of 24/7 mentality. I mean, we all have to sleep. If we don't sleep, we're not going to be able to function. But those points in our day-to-day routine that enable us to check in, maybe that's the important point here. I mean, we certainly advocate real-time data is the best kind of data to have, because it's fresh. We don't like data that's becoming stale because, data can change so quickly as well, particularly once you start getting it into the world of tweeting. So I think it's really about choosing to be nimble at certain points of the day within the realms of having to live your life too. But I don't think we can fall asleep on the job either. You can't just rock up on a Monday morning, skim the papers and think that's it for the end of the week. It doesn't work like that. But equally, a little bit of humanity in the process is a good thing.
I think from a corporate
James,
so I think one of the things that this really points to is, and looking at the fact that the poll was CMOs and people with global or international or national remits. I think one of the things that this speaks to is that it is exactly that personal versus professional, because people don't want to be working at 11 p.m. in the evening. And the solution ultimately to that is going to be forced on most CMOs, heads of corporate comms, whatever it may be, which is that all of us will have to delegate throughout the team the ability to be standalone in respect of comms, any crises, any short-term, because you always have a choice. Is it better that a negative tweet, Facebook post, whatever it may be, is it better that that is left unanswered for 12 hours, or is it better that it's answered, albeit not perfectly, by somebody within the team? I think 2 years ago, maybe it was better that it wasn't answered, but or 3 or 4 years ago, I think we're entering an age where it has to be answered. And therefore, that really means that this excess of control, which is often found, and particularly within very senior people within CMO, head of corporate comms roles, because they're very worried about making a mistake to some extent, not just for themselves, but for the external perception of their own role. They're very worried about making a mistake, is going to be, to some extent, trampled on regardless. There's going to have to be a 24-hour solution, and that means that every member of the team is going to have to be enabled to respond to whatever it may be that comes along. I just think that's going to be an inevitability.
Yeah.
Nick, I think, again, from examples from the political world, Harold Wilson talked about a week being a long time in politics, and now we should be talking about, 5 minutes being a long time in politics. And we can see these changes in the morning. A minister might say, well, I'm definitely not resigning, it's got nothing to do with me. An hour later, the resignation happens. And we see this with decisions to invade countries. We see it with voting decisions. We're seeing it actually today with discussion about, obviously, the vote up in Scotland. And lots of these decisions, particularly in the political world, have to be made quickly, and time is of the essence. So we should be analysing the data on a real-time basis. However, I think common sense must prevail, and we need to be selective about certain types of data. And we had this whole thing 15, 20 years ago with email, and we had sort of also these unspoken about protocols. So if you get a letter, you respond within a week. If you get a fax, it's within a day or 2 days or whatever it is. And when you get an email, it's within 24 hours. And I think we need to start splitting up data sets and really understanding, based on common sense, stuff that you really have to respond to 24/7 constantly, and other stuff that you can say, well, I know it's important, but people understand to actually give an appropriate response takes a bit of time. And if we knee-jerk reaction to everything, then we won't be making the right decisions, or won't be interpreting, as Midge was saying, the data appropriately.
Just a question here, I think that's very much a good one for you, Imogen. Someone asking about, aside from PR coverage generated, it's difficult to show clients that are data-driven the benefit of some campaigns, especially things like PR stunts. What kind of data should we be analysing with that kind of campaign?
Oh, thank you, that person who asked that question. Gosh, well, I would say this is when we start to inject some creativity into the process in terms of assessing the impact of a PR stunt. There are many forms of media. We're lucky, we're spoiled today. It's not just down to what's running out there in the print media. There's so much that goes on online. And I would look for creativity in the process. And if it's a good stunt, people will see it, people will talk about it, people will tweet about it, people will share it, people will put it up on YouTube. But, you know, I would say think as broadly as you can. No idea is a bad idea in this case. Look at what has gone before your stunt in terms of other really, really great phenomenons that have occurred. What are the ones that stand out in your mind or in your team's mind or your client's mind? Anything that can help you paint the picture of success. So I say inject creativity, point to real-life events, because that will be in part your data, and don't be afraid to ask any type of target audience to contribute to that process.
Thank you, Imogen. Someone's made the very sensible point around this particular topic, which is that perhaps 40% of the people that responded to the survey don't have to operate in a real-time operation, because maybe their business is working during the day. I guess if you look at the way, say, customer services has gone, where people are interacting with the brand, through the evening, then obviously the day has extended for those service operations, and with people interacting with media throughout the course of the day, and I mean things being published throughout the course of the day. I mean, I can certainly see a situation where you have shifts within PR agencies where people do work in different sort of phases through the organisation, or if you're an international, if you've got an international team, looking at how you can sort of share the responses around around the different time zones. How does it, in thinking about the MPs and the sort of lobbying side of it, what's the expectation on MPs in terms of their responsiveness to the people in on social media?
Very well on social media. I mean, just tackling email, they all complain about getting vast quantities of email. So what's interesting is now the concept of these email campaigns where automated don't work. So because MPs hate them so much to get their inbox filled up, but they're also getting better at handling. So they also have these immediate response. Back, I'm busy, but I will get on to your request, and they do so. But moving on to social media, Twitter, obviously they're less on Facebook and they're less on LinkedIn and so forth, but a lot of them are very big and ambitious Twitter users. And the analysis we've seen is that a large number of MPs use Twitter very effectively. There were some pointers we've done for the last 2 or 3 years now, sort of a teaching to parliamentarians about how to use Twitter effectively, and we've had people from Twitter and other experts come and explain. And one of the things is actually not to have, one is analysing how they do it, and some just sort of blast out messages to everyone. Some will have one-to-one private messages, but the effectiveness, and I suppose we're talking about effectiveness particularly in the run-up to an election, what's interesting is how parliamentarians can use Twitter effectively to reach out to their constituents who ultimately will be voting for them in May next year. And a lot of them are doing it very effectively, having these conversations. So they'll tweet, just at Joe's Cafe in my constituency, always great, cheap and wonderful cup of coffee there, and making sure that reaches a wide audience is a nice way of saying, I'm in the patch, I'm working hard for you, and I'm happy to have these local contacts. And things like that are the ways that I think the MPs are growing quite sophisticated in their use of social media. Not everyone, but I think it's starting to have an effect for them.
Great. A comment here that I think Barry Legacy from AMEC would agree with, saying that people should agree KPIs with their key stakeholders ahead of the campaign proceeding. Some of them might be database, some of them might be other elements. So I think, Barry with the valid metrics framework would very much subscribe to that view. Oops. So moving on, we've obviously talked a lot about data and how that's playing a bigger and bigger role in comms and how we evaluate the work we do and plan. But what we then wanted to sort of look in a bit more detail in terms of to what extent do we trust this data? Interesting enough, only 49% of marketeers completely trust their own data. And what was even more interesting is that only 39% of marketers completely trusted the data of communication of the comms department, and lesser still, of other departments within business. So when I first saw this, I thought this is pretty negative. That there's this negative, view of data, and that, this slightly sort of backward-looking. But then I was sort of reflecting on it a bit more, and I thought it was a healthy skepticism. That I think you cannot rely solely on data, and that it's only really with experience that you can sort of get the measure of that data and use it constructively. So, what's the view? Are you surprised by these findings that people don't trust data even from their own department?
Is this when we roll out the quote that 76% of all statistics are made up on the spot? I think healthy skepticism is very good. I think you need to be questioning of where data comes from, who's produced the data. The provenance is all important, and I think for me, like you, that healthy skepticism I think is quite important. I would say though, I think from boardrooms and CEOs, they'll say we don't want data, we want facts to make decisions, and obviously that's all in an ideal world. Mark Twain talked about statistics. He said there are three kinds of lies: damn lies, and of course statistics. But I think we could have a very interesting debate about this link between correlation and causation, which goes to the heart of this data issue, especially when you look at the internet. It's almost that BuzzFeed has made a fortune by coming up with correlation between funny things, mainly cats, and making those link between things. I've actually got a printout. Here's a couple of them, the funny ones. So ice cream consumption leads to murder, obviously with a nice graph showing the increase in murder rates with the increase in ice cream consumption. There's a few more here. Pirate shortage is caused global warming. Using Internet Explorer leads to murder. And one of my favorite ones is Mexican lemon imports prevent highway deaths. But there's lots of them. Obesity caused the debt bubble, and Facebook caused the Greek debt crisis. So you can actually link anything to anything if you want with statistics, and I think our job as consultants to help our clients actually get through this vast array of data, and that's going back to the beginning, make it quite meaningful. But these amazing opportunities, we all know the PR opportunities for tea, coffee, spinach, red wine, cranberries, I can't think of anything, any health food that can be equated with, and you have a wonderful campaign out of it. The problem is the following week it will say that too much spinach is is going to turn you into looking like Popeye. So we do have to be very sceptical, and I think provenance of data and not making a mistake between correlation and actual causation.
I would agree, and I'd add to that, and I'd say it is a very vital part of the process to interrogate the data. The data is only one of many tools to look at what's really hidden beneath, and I think the data can help to steer that conversation, make it a richer conversation, and I think as communications professionals, it's important that we do push the bar in terms of investigating why a person has said a particular thing, why a data point has come out in a particular way. If we don't interrogate the data, if we don't challenge what we see, then I would personally say that's limiting what we should be doing as comms professionals. It's our job to see the round, to sell the round, and to educate and work with our clients to take advantage of the round in front of us. The one thing I've been sharing this week with many people. I've just finished a book which was written by Ed Catmull, who's the president of Pixar, which then merged with Disney Animation. He spent 26 years working with Steve Jobs, and talks in his book Creativity Inc. He talks about the value of creativity in terms of driving company culture, and a part of his book is dedicated to the role of data. And he says that data is important, but it's not the be-all and end-all. And in particular, he says, I like data because it is neutral. There are no value judgments, only facts. And I think when you couple the facts with creativity, innovation, insight, inspiration, all of those things, great people with great minds, then only fantastic things can follow.
I think it's very interesting, again, when you juxtapose that, 49% don't completely trust their own data, with 83% earlier on who think that data is used effectively. And I think what it really comes down to is that they're generally prepared to give data the benefit of the doubt. Certainly, when you're making very fine value judgments, as you are when you're sitting as a CMO, or when you're at the top of any of these organizations, you tend to be making fine value judgments with different opinions coming at you from everywhere. And while you don't completely trust the data that you have in front of you, and 49% said that they don't completely, 83% said that they think that the data is used effectively. So I think that they don't totally trust the data, but they take the view that it's probably largely right. Even if it's not completely right, there's probably 80-20 rule. It's probably telling you something useful.
Yeah.
And therefore you can use that data effectively. But I do go back to Imogen's earlier point, which I think is absolutely right, that you there is still a very strong art side of it. Also, I think the rise of marketing versus PR, especially in big corporates, has also led to data being having more kudos to some extent than it would be if it had just been left in the hands of PR alone. I think to some extent it originally was forced on PR, whereas now I think the PR is learning to use data very effectively, having sat on both the PR and marketing side. And lastly, I was thrilled to see that, as a former lawyer, that I think only 24% of people trusted anything they received from lawyers and procurement, and how right they are. So I thought that was great.
So yes, we shouldn't feel too bad being if we're in marketing comms. So there's an interesting question here. Just like I guess a lot of companies have data at their disposal, and I guess James, you've worked in areas where you've had a lot of data at your disposal to potentially use within your communications in terms of sharing insights and interesting findings. Do you think any of this should put businesses off from using their own internal data to sort of for thought leadership, for trends? I mean, maybe across the panel here, what's the view on that? Is there?
I'm firmly of the view that data is valuable, to some extent in the same way that there's a huge amount of evidence that the wisdom of crowds is better than the wisdom of any one individual. It's funny when they write books about innovation or anything else that many people have commented that Steve Jobs and people like him are actually the exception. Absolutely the exception. It's very, very rare that you get an individual who drives innovation all on their own. It's usually the wisdom of crowds. You get the right people with the right background. And to some extent, data is replicating the wisdom of crowds because it's providing multiple data points instead of a single data point.
Yeah.
And so I think that even in the human realm, we tend to, and certainly in my experience, the best CMOs or heads of corporate comms or whatever it may be, tend to ask for everybody's opinion and then try to come to a conclusion on the basis of that, and that tends to lead to a better result than just saying I have a maverick genius here and I'm just going to blindly follow whatever that maverick genius does. So I think there is a really important role for data. I think that we're probably a few years away from completely mastering it, but as long as the right question is asked using the right data points, then there's tremendous value that can be found from it. And certainly just sort of anecdotally, Alibaba had a very, very strong bias towards using data before taking any action.
Yeah.
And creativity was, to some extent, certainly bolted on top of that, but the data underpinnings always had to be reasonably, or as sound as could possibly be derived.
I think we touched on this earlier, the concept of how do you break the mold, and if you always follow the data previously, you arguably can't break this new ground. So your analogy with how computers were in the 70s and 80s and even in the 90s, they were sort of black plastic, big and ugly. And had we followed data sets, what do you expect a computer to look like? It might have always been like that. And instead, as you said, Jobs sort of used a British designer who'd been rejected from lots of places apparently. And then we had Apple creating these wonderful new products that we couldn't have actually envisaged beforehand. And I think that innovation, you sometimes need to mutate and break the mold and change and reject what's gone before. And you need to do a bit of that. The question is obviously getting it right. And obviously, if you're talking about billions of pounds in terms of e-commerce, you want to get things right, and you do obviously have to analyse the data.
Mm. What's the? I mean, Nick, I know that one of the areas you sort of as an extension of the use of data is around focus groups. Thinking this from a lobbying perspective, what's the sort of the temperature as far as sort of people's view of focus groups today and how they're applied?
Well, it's very interesting, the wisdom of the crowd we've just mentioned. There was actually an article in the press about the campaign in Scotland and how the Better Together campaign had decided to spend money, quite a lot of it, on focus groups, and that had given them the insight to go down and focus on the issue around currency, because that was, according to the focus group, the issue that would be very critical. And indeed, in the first debate that we saw on TV, it was indeed critical. But now we're seeing that this the moves for the Yes campaign for Independence of Scotland is now looking at their spend on money. Instead of being a focus group, it's been on getting those banners and posters out and being very present. So again, following the data of focus groups might not have been the right answer. So again, it's horses for courses. It's which focus groups you're asking and what is the question you're putting to them.
Okay.
And do we want a conviction politician nowadays versus a focus-driven politician?
Absolutely, yeah.
Thinking about some of the different themes that we've covered, I think maybe as we sort of work towards the end of this webinar, it'd be very interesting to get everyone's perspective on what we think might be the next big trend in communications evaluation. That one of the people that's asked this question is sort of asked that we look beyond just purely social media. So I think we talk a lot about that. What do we think is might be some of the sort of future trends around communications evaluation?
For my part, I would say it's the emotional intelligence that interests me. It's the passion behind the words. It's what's not being said, or is being said, by silence, if you like. We have a great adage in our business: you should never mistake silence for satisfaction. The person who's being silent generally has a very critical view on your business and your service delivery. And I think nailing how you measure the EQ piece, if you like, in the debate is going to be key going forward. And because with data comes passion, and with passion comes belief, and belief, informs decision making, and it can break you, it can make you. So that would be my instinctive answer to that.
Okay.
So my answer would be looking at understanding where power lies, where decision-making and influence is made. So it's not necessarily the breadth or the numbers of people who ask, it's much more qualitative. And so key opinion leaders, I think, have become more important.
Yeah.
And those people that, whether it's in newspaper columns, the classic thing is, do we need newspapers anymore? Because we're all publishers. And the answer is that's not true. Some people write, and some people have thoughts that are better than others. And if you read leaders in the broadsheets, they're worth reading. If you read every single blog on the internet, they're not. And so you do have to put quality in perspective. And I think there'll always be a place for good journalism. There'll always be a good place for people who are able to influence or have power because of their opinions, because of their the quality of their thoughts. And I think we need to look at measuring that and not just play a numbers game.
Okay.
I think looking to the short-term future, that what Nick has said is absolutely right about key opinion leaders, and the classic example of this is China, which to some extent came a little bit later to social media, but also has accelerated past the West in many ways in terms of usage and everything else. And what you're seeing is that the distribution of people who actually listen to the people who have mass followers, etc., vastly outweigh everybody else. And so you're getting these real outliers where they have incredible influence and power. And I suspect that within each niche and within each vertical, that's to some extent the way that the West is going to go more and more over time in the short term. I think in the long term, really, we're looking at this in terms of media only and what we can analyze from the media. I think our ability to analyze quantitative is well established now, qualitative less so, but we're getting there, and can generally just use algorithms to determine the positive sentiment around any particular brand. My suspicion is that there will probably be better direct routes into the consumer's mind. What that mechanism will be, I think, is unknown. But I think the future is that something will go out through any given media, and we won't be measuring eventually the how the media pick that up. We will be measuring how consumers pick that up, and what the consumer sentiment was around that. How that will be done, I don't think is determined yet, but I suspect that's the future.
Sort of like futurology type of.
Yes, yeah. So that's looking out 5 to 10 years rather than 2 or 3.
And I think from, oh sorry, do you?
No, that was it.
And so I mean, I think just adding my own perspective on this, I think we've obviously become much better at planning. You know, we've become much more rigorous in terms of how we evaluate what we do. I think for me, the only concern I've got is that in being so sort of laser focused on all of this, that we don't lose that creative dimension of communications, and in terms of like looking for those greenfield opportunities, which aren't necessarily obvious, aren't necessarily the things we were originally aiming for, but they pop up. So I think things that can help us to identify those, I think could be very, very valuable as we move forward. So some great sort of final thoughts there in terms of emotional intelligence, you know, looking at key opinion leaders, futurology, and maybe before we wrap up, going back to the original title, you know, how can the comms function and people working comms sort of get more influence on the board and on the C level? Any last final remarks from you guys? What's the secret?
I'd say understand the mind of the CEO or the board, because I think they have different views and different ambitions, and I think that would be something to take on board if you're doing campaigns as a head of marketing or comms, is understand who you're getting that data for and what type of decisions do they want to make about their business.
Great, thank you, Nick.
I think if it's good, it gets noticed. It's very easy for me to say, it's very tough to get to that good bit, but if it is good, it gets noticed. And it's a question of understanding the mechanics behind that, what really makes for a good campaign that gets attention, that everybody sort of goes, oh yes, I saw that, or I've heard something about that, you know, makes them want to find out more. So, and I do believe that if it's in life for all things, if it's good, it gets noticed.
I think, I mean, obviously when you're looking at a board, you're always looking at different constituencies with different demands. The CFO is always very powerful, and so to some extent you're dealing with different audiences. So I think the answer always is to have a data before and data after approach when you're doing anything involving the CFO, and ultimately the CFO controls budgets as much as most CEOs. And so that's really showing the planning up front with at least some databases, and then the data after showing that value for money was derived, and that's particularly obviously important in the PR and comm space generally, but very much so in PR, which can be a fantastically valuable tool if used correctly. And then I think from the point of view of the CEO, I think the features that allow most people to become CEO, and no offense, Brendan, and anybody else, but the features are also the enthusiasm to be in the limelight. And so I think if the CEO is not your current spokesperson, very often, if you can make the CEO look good out of all of this, he or she will generally be much more beneficially disposed towards any PR. And so I think that should always be in the back of your mind, is how to ensure that it's not just the company, but also that individual who is looking good, who's well briefed, and who is, you know, getting into decent publications wherever it may be.
Can I just expand on that point actually of James in terms of talking about the CFO and showing him or her the data up front and post-campaign. I don't think you can underestimate the value of infographics in all of this. You know, data can look very dense, crunchy, dull, like sticky paint. Actually, there is an art in how you present that data. And we would certainly advocate, particularly when you're trying to get across something quite complex, whether it's a major campaign that's involved a major investment, if you can visualize that in a way that someone important with decision-making power at a glance can see the value of what you have done, tick box.
Brilliant. And I think my sort of final remark would be, I'm really hoping that access to this data just gives people working in comms that little bit more confidence to be bolder, you know, in our relationships with the sort of the C-level. I think we've always, you know, known that we play a vital role, but I think, you know, hopefully this data will give us that little bit more confidence too, because in reality, you know, we are the eyes. You know, we are the ears and very often the voice of the organisation. You know, and I think, you know, the new generation of CEOs that's coming through very much appreciate that. And I think there's a massive opportunity for comms to seize that opportunity. So thank you very much to our panellists, Nick, Imogen, and James for joining this. And thank you for Gorkana for hosting. And enjoy the rest of Measurement Week, and we will be making this recording available and supporting documents available. So thank you.